Hello, everyone. Welcome to Knowledge Line, Episode 3, Part 2 on Promise. My name is Tony Okoma, and I am your host. We are today continuing our very interesting discussion we had in the Part 1 of this episode, and we shall be looking into a few more things we could not cover the last time. I did say we shall be considering, amongst others, a very important but heated debate: why people make lying promises. That is, promises they do not intend to keep. And we shall be looking at the characteristics of such people also. We shall be considering the consequences and dangers of a failed promise, including lying promise. If time permits us today, we shall be attempting a difficult but not impossible task. How can we know or differentiate a failed promise from a lying promise? Again, it is a very difficult task because the two seem to almost be the same. Differentiating a failed promise from a lying promise, because in itself a lying promise is a failed promise. But in going into today's discussion, one of the things I would like us to know, as discussed in the previous conversation, is that not all failed promise is a lying promise. Therefore, a definition of a lying promise is essential in differentiating a failed promise from a lying promise. Most consensus of the meaning of a failed or broken promise, as some people call it, is lying. And what is lying? Lying is to not do what one promised he or she will definitely do. And a lying promise is when you give a promise you know you do not intend to keep. A failed promise is when you fail to do what you said you will definitely do. That is a failed promise. But a lying promise is when you deliberately make a promise you know you are not intending to keep. That is a lying promise. When you deliberately make a promise you know you are not going to keep, that is a lying promise. But why do you not intend to keep the promise? Could be attributed to various reasons. I'll repeat that again. Why you do not intend to keep the promise could be as a result of very many various reasons. However, the one greatest concern of why some people may not be able to keep the promise is the lack of ability or the means to keep that promise. Example of such is borrowing money with a promise to pay back when you know you do not have the means or the ability to pay back. Well, the lack of ability or means to pay back is an intention, in quote, not to keep the promise. It is an intention, in quote, as I said, not to pay back that borrowed money. It is an intention not to keep the promise. The lack of ability or the means to pay back is in itself an intention not to keep a promise. So, why do people then give promises they can't keep? You may ask. Promises you cannot keep, again, we will emphasize, is different from promises you do not intend to keep. However, there's a very, very thin line separating the two. The simple reason why people give promises they cannot keep is simply ego. It could be a factor to that. The desire to impress. Ego. Often from peer pressure. Well, this is called a secondary line promise. We shall get to that later on. It is called a secondary line promise. The lack of ability or the means to keep a promise could be classed as a secondary line promise. Again, we will come to that at the later stage. Most people give promises they do not intend to keep, often categorized as primary or line promise. That is the primary line promise. Promise you do not intend to keep is classified as a primary line promise. Promises you do not have the ability or the means to keep is classified as secondary line promise. Again, as I said earlier on, we will come to this later on. But most people give promises they do not intend to keep, which is the primary line promise, simply for the sheer reason of trying to gain advantage over the others. So you see the difference now. The reason some people make secondary line promise, which is possibly the lack of ability to keep the promise or the means to keep the promise, just sheer ego. Ego resulting most times from peer pressures. The desire to impress, and so on and so forth. So, but the primary line promise is the promise given with the mind from the onset that that promise is not going to be kept. It's not going to be fulfilled. And why do people do that? They do this simply to gain advantage over the others. That is the reason. They capitalize by stoking up emotions to promise things they know they are never going to keep. They play on things that are important to their audience, things that they know the people are passionate about. Things they know that people see as very important to them. So they play on the emotions of the people by promising them things they want to hear, things they know that are important to them, things that will make them to act, things that will make them to react. So they play on the emotions and they capitalize on what the people are passionate about. And they give promises they know they do not intend to keep, or they are never going to be able to keep. The chief characters of lying promise are politicians. The chief characters of lying promise are mostly politicians. They promise things they know they do not intend to do. Things they know they are not going to keep. Things they know are unachievable, but they perceive as important to the people and their target audience, something they know the people are passionate about and emotionally attached to. Example of a lying promise that fits this classification is that of the former President of the United States of America, President Trump, and the so-called border wall, which he promised that he was going to build and that Mexico will pay for it. Absolutely. Every rational thinking man or woman will know that that is certainly, or most certainly, a promise that is not likely to ever be fulfilled, a promise that they know that may never be kept. But he knew that that was important to his audience. He knew that that was important to the people. It's something they were very, very passionate about. And he used that to gain advantage. He knew that Mexico was never going to foot the bill for a border wall that is built or constructed by America or the United States, say. More of this will follow in my upcoming book, which is entitled The Infantile President. We're going to hear more about this time in the new coming book, The Infantile President. Another classical example of lying promise is the failed promise of the Nick Clegg's-led Liberal Democrat Party. Tuition fees that were promised in 2010 general election, which helped the Liberal Democrats into a coalition government with the David Cameron's led Conservative Party that could not win the majority vote required to form a government. Nick Clegg and the Liberal Dems, who cashed in on the emotions and passions of both parents and students of the tertiary institutions in the United Kingdom in 2010, people who were just coming out from one of the worst economic recessions, global economic recessions at that time, and they knew that the promise of the abolition of a tuition fee in tertiary institution is something that is so important, something that they knew that both parents and students were passionate about, and of course, indeed is everything to them at that time. They capitalize on the emotions of the people to gain advantage. And of course, what happened? When they came into a coalition government with the David Cameron's led Conservative Party, did they fulfill the promise? No. But it had consequences. Such always have consequences. And of course, they paid dearly for it in the 2015 local election. The Liberal Democrats lost badly. They were almost wiped out. They lost many seats that they gained in 2010 as a result of the consequences of the failed promise of 2010. Again, as I said earlier on, we shall be looking into the consequences of lying promise, probably toward the closing stage of this very interesting conversation, maybe in our next episode, in our next part, which probably will be the part 3 of it. If it does not extend to part 4, we shall find out. However, to help us establish a firmer foundation on this topic, we must always remember that not all failed promise is a lying promise. I will emphasize it again. We must always remember that not all failed promise is a lying promise. Some failed promises are circumstantial. That means, like in a real contract, the result of the force majeure, like unforeseen or unexpected natural disasters, wars, bereavements, etc., something the promisee can see and relate to that are inevitable and impactful on the ability of the promisor to deliver. There are some circumstantial, occurrences that could make the promisor unable to deliver the promised. Yes, it's very possible. So that's why we are always quick to emphasize that not all failed promise is a lying promise. But we must still be quick to remind us that the promise you cannot keep is different from the promise you do not intend to keep. And both, as we had established earlier, are classed differently as secondary and primary lying promises. But they all have almost equal consequences. It is difficult trying to separate the two. Is very, very difficult. It will never be ascertained whether President Trump's failure to build the border wall and get Mexico to pay for it was because he had not the ability to fulfill the promise, or that he did not ever intend to fulfill that promise. And same with the case of neglect and the liberal Dems regarding the failed tuition fee promise. The certainty or lack of categorization of where they could fall into makes it the more difficult to prosecute lying promise in law courts. Hence, politicians get away with what are obvious murders. This is because to prove a lying promise, the court relies on the legal principle of exact ante. That is the principle of exact ante. It's a Latin word, which means beforehand. What are they trying to say here? Is saying that to prove whether there was a lying promise, we will first of all have to establish what was the original mindset of the promisor. This is a very difficult task to establish, isn't it? Yes, we will have to first prove or establish the original intention of the promisor. But it's only the promisor that actually knows his or her original intention as at when that promise was given. It means in legal context, we must establish whether the promisor had originally intended to keep the promise, or that he set out to mislead or deceive the promisee. That's the task we will have to prove when we bring such cases to law courts, which is very difficult. But how can you know if the promisor had the intention to keep the promise when it was originally given? This is why it is so difficult to get politicians to account for their failed promises in court. The only way to hold them accountable is by voting them out in another election. But politicians are not the only people that give lying promises. And how do we address this? How can we find a remedy to this very all-important issue? I shall be giving my opinion on this debate at the closing stage of our conversation, when we shall be looking at the consequences of failed promise and what happens to people who normally make lying promises. So, ladies and gentlemen, I encourage you to stay tuned as we all embark on all this interesting, though heated topical conversation. You can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You can as well write to me for any questions on what we have been discussing via tokonma.knowledgeline@gmail.com. My email handle again is tokonma.knowledgeline@gmail.com. For more on these issues, you can as well purchase a copy of my book entitled The Lives of an Honest Man, for many more other information on this very interesting conversation. You can as well order the book by writing direct to ishifinance@gmail.com, and then they can follow it up from there to get your book across to you straight away. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for staying tuned in, and look forward to having you around again sometime in a few weeks' time. Thank you.